Darcy Moore lived with her mother in a small town in northern Oklahoma. The girl never knew her father, but from her mother, she knew that he had abandoned them even before Darcy was born. Pamela Moore didn't like to share her memories of the past with Darcy. The girl knew that in her younger years, her mother lived in New York, where she met the man who stole her heart. It's hard to say what caused the breakup, but it was the reason behind Pamela's return to her hometown. Most likely, it was this incident that broke the young woman from a provincial town, setting the course for the rest of her life. Having given birth to a baby girl, Pamela became an unsociable housewife who gave up on her personal life. Raising her daughter, the woman was strict and never allowed Darcy any liberties. Perhaps Mrs. Moore simply didn't want her daughter to follow in her footsteps and repeat the same mistakes. That is why Darcy could never spend the night at her friend's house or stay out late for a rare date with her boyfriend. And if her daughter did come home after curfew, her mother never failed to start a fight, which always ended in a long monologue about how all men are the same and they dream of only one thing. "But Mom, I'm an adult already," Darcy used to say in such cases, understanding deep down the futility of her attempts to justify herself. "I know what kind of adult you are. Everyone says they're all grown up and then they make one mistake after another," Mrs. Moore used to answer, trying to convince her daughter that she was right. After such fights, Darcy usually locked herself in her room and, lying in bed, dreamed of how one day she would get to live her life as she saw fit. This was also due to the fact that after these arguments, Darcy's mother invariably started a conversation about how Darcy shouldn't be too stubborn or defiant. "You should take a closer look at Dylan. He's a good man, reliable. I'm sure he would make a worthy match for you," Mrs. Moore would add. Darcy would only shrug her shoulders in response, unwilling to offend her mother with an awkward word. The fact was that the young woman didn't like Dylan at all. He drove around in his old Cadillac and considered himself a rising star of the local football team. Sure, he had repeatedly tried to get at Darcy, but the woman remained indifferent to the clumsy expressions of his sympathy. Deep down, Mrs. Moore was very worried about this issue. The woman wanted her daughter to always stay in her sight, under her tireless control. Moreover, Mrs. Moore's close friends always pointed out that it was about time for Darcy to get married. Music? "If it goes on like this, she's going to be single until her hair turns gray," said Olivia Harris over a cup of tea in the kitchen. "I know, my friend, I know, but she is so stubborn. She keeps hoping to go to New York. It beckons her like nothing else," Mrs. Moore complained, recalling her own failure in a similar adventure. "Maybe you should let her go. Let her try. She's an adult after all," Olivia noted cautiously. "No, she's too naive for it. She'll get fooled there. Men are very persuasive, but all they want is to get under a woman's skirt," Mrs. Moore said with an emphasis on the last sentence. Unfortunately, the women were too loud talking in the kitchen, and Darcy, who had come home from the store, happened to accidentally listen in on their conversation. The woman's cheeks flushed, and tears welled up in her eyes. Darcy was very upset that her mother didn't believe in her and considered her unfit for a life in a big city. The situation was aggravated by the fact that the woman met her friend Laura at the supermarket. Smiling happily, she told Darcy that her father had promised her to take her to New York. "Can you imagine the big city and its endless possibilities? I've already signed up for a course to learn to do manicures. I will get a certificate, and I will never be out of work. You can come with me if you want. My parents will be happy about it," Laura suggested. "Thank you, I'd be happy to come, but my mom, she's very strict. There's no way she's going to let me go," Darcy answered, embarrassed, trying not to see the amused expression on her friend's face. "Look, it's up to you. After all, you only get one life. If you change your mind, just come by. We're leaving tomorrow morning," Laura said instead of goodbye and went towards the exit. Of course, Darcy understood that her friend's parents were rich and could afford to move their daughter to New York. But now, having heard her mother's conversation with Mrs. Harris, the woman realized that she couldn't continue living this way. Darcy knew that her mother would never let her go to New York on her own free will. A couple of years ago, the woman had already tried it, but Mrs. Moore immediately started complaining of chest pains and had to be taken to the hospital. It is worth noting that her attending physician was at a complete loss since Pamela's EKG showed no abnormalities whatsoever. And this could only mean one thing: Darcy's mother pretended to be sick in order to force her to stay home. That time, Mrs. Moore succeeded, but now, the desperate woman knew what she was up against, and she wasn't going to miss her chance again. That night, Darcy secretly called her friend and agreed to go with her to New York. Knowing Darcy's situation, Laura asked, "And what about your mom?" "Hold on, are you going to run away?" "Wow, that's something. To be honest, I didn't expect that from you." Leaving Laura's question unanswered, Darcy hung up the phone and started packing. Fortunately, her mother was watching her favorite talk show and didn't hear the sounds coming from her daughter's room. Darcy had enough money for the trip and to settle down in the new place. She worked on the farm all summer and saved a little from each salary. Having waited for her mother to go to bed, the woman took a piece of paper and a pen. Then, barely managing to hold back her tears, Darcy wrote a farewell letter to her mother, asking her not to be mad and not to go looking for her. As she left her home, Darcy felt that this decision would change her entire life. Only when she was already out on the street did the woman let herself cry. She cried all the way to Laura's house. Darcy was saying goodbye to her past, trying not to think about the hated farm, Dylan's annoying looks, and the mocking remarks of her peers who had all along started their own families. Laura warmly greeted her friend at the door of her house. Her parents respected Darcy and were glad that she would be traveling with their daughter. Since the trip was going to be a long one, the young woman settled comfortably in the back seat and, lulled by the rumbles of the tires on the road, quickly fell asleep. Darcy woke up before her friend did and, looking at the fields and road signs flashing outside the window, quietly prayed that her mother would forgive her and wouldn't despise her for her decision. With each next mile that brought Darcy closer to her dream, she felt incredible elation and lightness in her heart. Needless to say, when the women finally arrived in New York, they were overwhelmed by euphoria and joyful excitement. After the monotony of fields and farms, the lights of the metropolis beckoned them like a beacon, showing the way to lost sailors. Here it is, our new life. There won't be any more talks of weddings and the sad whining of Dylan, who was always upset that his old Cadillac needed repair and was falling apart on the go, Darcy whispered, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. Arriving in New York, the provincial travelers rented an apartment and, without wasting any precious time, set out to find jobs. Laura managed to get a job as a shop assistant in a small store, but it took Darcy some time to find a job she liked, a position as a hotel administrator. Going in for an interview with the owner, Darcy said a shy hello and sat down on a chair. A gray-haired man of about 50 years old was sitting at the table. He patiently listened to the woman and, as a whole, was satisfied with her candidacy. "Well, miss, you can start work tomorrow." "You know, you remind me of my old friends," said the owner and slightly moved the photo in a dark frame standing on his table. Darcy involuntarily looked at the picture and froze in surprise. "Is something wrong?" the owner asked cautiously. "Where did you get this photo?" Darcy asked, her voice trembling with excitement. "This is my Pamela. Unfortunately, she's been dead for a long time. We loved each other, but fate had its own plans for us." "Why does this surprise you so much?" the owner asked, perking up. "Because this is my mother." "Only she's young here," Darcy replied quietly, feeling her cheeks flush. No, that's impossible. "My Pamela died 25 years ago," the man said, making it clear that this conversation was over. "You're not listening. This is definitely my mother, Pamela Moore. She lives on a farm in Oklahoma now, and I'm her daughter," Darcy exclaimed. Hearing the woman's words, the owner turned pale and sank into his chair. He realized that it was highly unlikely that this strange woman would come in and lie to him. Moreover, his Pamela really was from Oklahoma. Feeling that she was about to burst into tears, Darcy ran out of the office and hurried out into the street. The fresh morning air cooled her hot cheeks for a moment. Darcy was panting like a beached fish, gasping for air. At that moment, the owner of the hotel quietly approached her from behind and took her by the shoulders. "But you really do look like Pamela. You have the same eyes, and your dimples," the man whispered. Then the man invited Darcy to sit on a nearby bench with him and began his story. "I met your mother when we were both 25 years old or so. It was probably love at first sight. We really wanted to get married, but one day, the bus that she took to visit her relatives in Oklahoma got in an accident. After that, Pamela's mother told me that her daughter had died. I really wanted to visit the grave of the love of my life, but my failed mother-in-law was against it, blaming me for Pamela's death. I was out of my mind with grief. She was expecting a baby. It's hard to even think about how devastated I was back then. But over time, I resigned myself to my fate and continued with my life, keeping the memory of Pamela in my heart," the man said, not having time to brush away the tears flowing down his face. "But she's alive, and I'm her daughter. The daughter of Pamela Moore, which means I'm your daughter too," Darcy whispered and hugged her father, whom she'd never seen in her life. As it turned out, Pamela's fiancé's name was Philip Gonzalez. Having lost his bride, the man could never find another soulmate. After 2 failed attempts at marriage and subsequent divorces, the man decided to live the rest of his life alone. And now, having learned that he had a daughter, Mr. Gonzalez was on cloud 9. Moreover, it meant that now he had a family whom he had dreamed of for so many years. And even though the love for Pamela had cooled down over time, he still felt respect for her. At Darcy's insistence, Philip Gonzalez even went with his daughter to Oklahoma to see her mother. But they were both disappointed to see Pamela meet her ex-fiancé rather coolly. All the emotions had long died in her heart. Moreover, it turned out that 25 years ago, Pamela's mother lied to her and said that Philip had left her. One could only try to guess how many tears the pregnant woman had shed, feeling betrayed by the love of her life. Mr. Gonzalez came up to Pamela and hugged her by the shoulders. He understood that their love had passed, and it was now impossible to revive the faded feelings. But on the other hand, realizing that he now had a daughter, the man felt truly happy. Unable to stop crying, Philip Gonzalez knelt down before Pamela and swore that he would do everything in his power to make sure their daughter was happy. "No need, Daddy. I believe you, and I love you," Darcy whispered, hugging both of her parents.